This video is brought to you by Brilliant. For the last 6 months, the front lines in Ukraine have been relatively stable. It looks like the much anticipated Russian offensive has exhausted itself, and the Russians are still yet to fully capture Bakhmut. However, the Ukrainians have made it clear that they're not happy with the status quo, and senior Ukrainian officials have been talking up the prospect of an imminent counteroffensive. So in this video, we thought we'd take another look at what's happening on the battlefield, when Ukraine's coming counteroffensive might happen, and what it'll need to succeed. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, before we get into the counteroffensive, a quick look at the front lines. There are basically two places experiencing intense fighting: Avdiivka, a suburb of Donetsk city, and Bakhmut. Avdiivka has been on the front line since 2014, so the Ukrainians have some pretty well-developed defensive fortifications there, which is why, for most of the last year or so, the Russians basically left it alone. However, in mid-March, regular Russian army troops and Patriot PMC, a private military company set up by Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, started trying to encircle the suburb by advancing in the north. This was then followed by an advance along the M30 motorway to the south, presumably in order to cut off the railway line and encircle Ukrainian troops in Avdiivka. Unfortunately for the Russians, the advance has apparently stalled, and the Russians have been unable to make any inroads into the suburb itself. Russian military blogger Igor Girkin warned on Tuesday that it would be impossible for the Russians to encircle Avdiivka before the Ukrainians' coming counteroffensive. And the fact that the Russians actually redeployed troops from Avdiivka to Bakhmut suggests they've accepted that they don't have the firepower to take both at the same time. In Bakhmut, the Russians have continued to make slow progress, and earlier this week, Ukrainian troops were forced to retreat west of the railway. This is partly down to the fact that the Russian army seems to have increased air support for Wagner troops in Bakhmut, and there have been reports that the Russians are now using larger munitions, including the Fab 1500. While this is bad news for the Ukrainians in the short term, especially given Ukraine's lack of viable air defense systems, the Russian army is unlikely to have very many of these bombs, and it might suggest that they're running low on more standard munitions. It's also worth noting that, even with this new air support, the Russian advance is still slow, and even Evgeny Prigozhin recently admitted that he didn't think the fall of Bakhmut would necessarily precede further Russian gains in Donbass. All in all, not much has changed. The Russians continue to make minor gains in Donbass, but at enormous cost, and the Ukrainians continue to retreat the Russians while avoiding encirclement. So that's what's happened on the front lines recently. Now on to the second part of this video, Ukraine's coming counteroffensive. There's been a lot of excited chatter about Ukraine's imminent counteroffensive recently, fueled by ambiguous statements by Ukrainian officials. In early March, Alexander Syrskyi, the commander of Ukraine's land forces, said that a counteroffensive is, quote, not far off. A few weeks later, on his Telegram channel, Syrskyi said that the Russians are losing significant forces in Bakhmut, and that very soon we will take advantage of this opportunity, as we did in the past. Unsurprisingly, these comments have fueled an endless stream of headlines predicting an imminent counteroffensive, but nothing has actually happened yet. So when is this actually going to happen? Well, the evidence suggests that the counteroffensive is unlikely to begin before May. American intelligence reckons that the ground in eastern Ukraine will remain muddy until early May, and the Pentagon documents leaked to the media last week suggest that, while 6 of Ukraine's new Western-supplied brigades will be ready by the end of March, the final 3 won't be ready until April the 30th at the earliest. This is broadly consistent with comments made by Ukrainian presidential advisor Mikhail Podolyak to Italian newspaper La Stampa at the beginning of March, when he said that any counteroffensive wouldn't start for at least 2 months. So, when this counteroffensive happens, where will it go? Well, as we argued in our previous Ukraine video, it looks like Ukraine could either stage an advance in the east around Donbass or in the south around Kherson and Zaporizhia. If they move east, the most likely target would be Svatove and Kreminna, two small towns joined by the P66 highway that are of strategic importance because they're used to transport supplies from Belgorod and other supply depots in western Russia down to Russian troops in places like Rubizne, Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. If they move south, the most tempting move would be to move south from Zaporizhia down towards Melitopol. Not only is Melitopol a major supply route, the city sits at the intersection of two major highways and a crucial rail line. But if the Ukrainians were to take it, they could split Russian forces in the south, isolating those Russians in Kherson Oblast and possibly presaging a siege of Crimea. Whatever Ukraine ends up deciding, there's an emerging consensus that making significant gains will be difficult. Russia has set up impressive fortifications in recent months, and Ukraine lacks the 3-to-1 manpower advantage typically required to overwhelm a defensive force. While we don't know precisely what they'll look like, the Pentagon leaks also suggest that Ukraine's Western-trained brigades won't be all that well armoured, with the new Western equipment spread relatively thinly across 9 new brigades, and the leaked documents predict only, quote, modest territorial gains. However, this feels a bit too pessimistic. While it'll be difficult, the success of the counteroffensive will really depend on the effectiveness of the troops trained in the West. In February, the US started a combined arms training program in Germany, involving over 600 Ukrainian soldiers. Thousands of Ukrainian soldiers and even a few Ukrainian officers are being trained in the British-led Operation Interflex, and last year the European Union set up the EU military assistance mission Ukraine in Germany and Poland, with the intention of training 15,000 Ukrainian troops. In total, over 20,000 Ukrainian troops are currently being trained in the West, representing about 10% of the Ukrainian army. 9 Western-trained brigades are expected to arrive in Ukraine by May, including more than 200 tanks, 800 other armoured vehicles, and 150 pieces of field artillery. And the counteroffensive will probably be their first test in real combat. Again, while significant advances will be difficult, given that no one knows yet quite how effective these Western brigades will be, any predictions, pessimistic or optimistic, have to be taken with a pinch of salt. These are all clearly huge decisions, but one much smaller, easier decision you can make is improving your skills and career prospects with Brilliant.org. That's because while we all know that the promise of AI is that it'll make our lives easier, it's very possible it'll make our work lives more difficult, replacing some people and requiring different skills of others. Brilliant, however, is the best way of improving your STEM skills quickly and in a fun way, investing in your own human intelligence. That's because Brilliant has thousands of lessons, from foundational and advanced maths to AI, data science, neural networks, decision-making, and more, with new lessons added monthly. And by the way, these lessons are interactive and engaging, designed around principles of active learning, so there's no boring lectures here. That means that by investing a few minutes every day in lifelong learning, you can improve your skills and feel a real sense of accomplishment. You can try everything Brilliant has to offer free for a full 30 days by clicking on the link in the description. Plus, the first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thanks for your support and for watching TLDR.